Now then, you're very welcome back. So we're discussing the Charles Byrnes case, which we were touching on in the news round. If you haven't been with us thus far, I'll give a brief summary of the situation and then we can unpack it in a bit more detail with our guest, Richard Forristal of the Racing Post. So Charles Byrnes, high-profile trainer, well-known trainer. He has won at the Cheltenham Festival in the past. He has had his licence suspended for 6 months and he's been fined €1,000. His horse, Viking Horde, is the name of the horse, and the suspension all centres around a race at Tramore Racecourse in October of 2018. So Viking Horde tested positive for a sedative. Now, there's a full written judgment today on the IHRB website today, which all the information I'm giving you comes from. So the written judgment said of the race, the gelding ran conspicuously badly. It received a reminder from the rider immediately after jumping the first hurdle. It became rapidly detached from the rest of the field and was pulled up before the 7th hurdle. So that raised suspicions, as you can imagine. A sample tested positive for this sedative. The trainer, Charles Byrnes, requested B sample analysis. That happened in France. The A sample had been tested in the UK. Both were positive. In fact, the concentration of the sedative in Viking Horde's system was 100 times the legal limit. Now, the written judgment in the case says that the horse was subject to, quote, a dangerous degree of sedation during the race, and, end quote, talks about how this put the safety of the horse, the rider, the other horses and riders very much at risk as well. And then there was circumstantial evidence, namely the bedding patterns here. So on the morning of this race at Tramore in 2018, Viking Horde started the day around 4-1 in the betting, drifted to a starting price of 8-1, and there were substantial bets placed on the horse to lose. So one bet, for instance, €34,889 to win €3,200. And there were other betting patterns concerning this horse, which we'll come to across 2018. The Irish editor of the Racing Post is Richard Forristal. Richard, evening.
Hi, Joe.
Lots to unpack here, to say the least.
Yeah, it's a bizarre case. I was interested to hear Dan speaking about it as well earlier. Dan would be an old independent colleague of mine, and he's a keen racing man, as you well know. Look, we've heard a lot of talk, I suppose, in the last couple of months about the robustness or otherwise of the IHRB anti-doping procedures and whatnot. And this, I would suggest, is possibly a bit of a red herring in that respect, because for the most part, those questions apply in relation to performance-enhancing substances and that sort of thing. This is a different kettle of fish altogether, altogether more sinister in one respect, because, as you have alluded to there, the volume of sedative, the amount of sedative that was identified in Viking Horde system at Tramore in October 2018, if we often hear the old phrase, Joe, it's enough to knock a horse. Well, I'd suggest that was nearly the case here. We don't know how it got there. That's one of the inexplicable things about all this. But we do know, especially when we look back now at the race with this evidence in hindsight, Viking Horde had to be bustled along to keep up with the rear of the field on the way to the first hurdle, made a mistake at the first hurdle, was given a reminder by his jockey straight after to buck up his ideas. Little did he know, I'm sure, about what was going on at the time. And he was chased along throughout and pulled up eventually when he was detached. So now that we know that he was heavily sedated, the fact that he pulled up unscathed and his rider was unharmed is something of a relief at this stage, I suppose, when you consider what was in his system. The whole thing is very, very strange. The frustrating aspect of it, as I suggested there, is that they haven't been able to identify who did it. They haven't been able to prove or disprove that Charles Byrnes or his son did it. They brought the horse to the race, and in the report we see that they left him on 2 occasions to get a rug and to get a bit of food for themselves for a total of around 25 minutes. Which would suggest that there was a window there for someone else possibly to do it. But there was no CCTV coverage in or around the stables, so they can't identify whether someone else accessed the horse. And either way, whether it's Charles Byrnes or his son, which we're not suggesting it is, or someone else within the stables, the bottom line is, the suggestion here is that somebody within the stable yard, because the conclusion seemed to suggest that the medical evidence suggested that they were satisfied it was administered close to the race, within a few hours of the race. So the suggestion is it was administered on the racecourse ground, and the only people allowed inside the stable yard are registered licensed individuals, if you like, people who are accredited to get in there by the IHRB. So regardless of who it is, it looks like a very, very sinister incident. As you said, there was two other lay bets mentioned in this in relation to a couple of his previous runs. On both occasions, the horse was tested and tested negative for anything. There was nothing found in his system on either occasion. So it really turns on this one case at Tramore, and there are an awful lot of unanswered questions arising out of it, unfortunately.
There are. So the suspension of his licence for 6 months, given the seriousness of what's happened, may strike people as lenient, and it's probably just worth giving the IHRB's explanation of how they've arrived at that conclusion. In effect, the ban is for his neglect in supervising the gelding at all times, and that's as far as this goes. And so the point they make effectively is that when it comes to finding direct evidence of who administered a prohibited substance, they say direct evidence of administration will rarely be available for obvious reasons. And they say a finding against a trainer of misconduct like this would inevitably be followed by a lengthy or permanent withdrawal of a licence. It could also attract a criminal investigation and/or liability. And then they quote some case law going back a while, and they say effectively, if we're going to make allegations or put forward findings which attract criminal investigation, that changes the burden of proof on us here. So they say, in summary, the law is that where serious allegations are made in civil proceedings, the tribunal must apply the standard of proof in a rigorous and exacting manner, and they require clear and convincing proof before a grave allegation is established as a matter of probability, because their burden of proof is balance of probability. So they say, and it's interesting in the report, they highlight certain things they say are important, and one of the sentences is, suspicion, no matter how strong, is not evidence for this purpose. And therefore, Charles Byrnes is only found guilty of neglecting the supervision of the gelding in this instance. So that is why it's a 6-month suspension, and he has not been found guilty of administrating the substance. To develop a few points, so, you know, the €34,889 to win €3,200. I mean, the betting patterns here are extraordinary. The other two races you mentioned, Sedgefield in October, same horse we're talking about here, Sedgefield in October, 2018 as well, €30,279 to win 12 grand. And again, in the betting that day, drifted from 3 to 1 out to 10 to 1. And then Galway in July, 55 grand placed to win 12. 4 to 1, drifted out to 8 to 1. As you said, samples were taken there. But two things jump out about betting practices as part of this whole issue that racing really needs to clean up. In the judgment, Richie, they talk about how the bets were made by a limited liability company, which then put them in turn with Betfair. They say that makes it really difficult to trace where the money's going, to trace the beneficiaries. So they're surprised that's allowed. And then the other point they make is, at a later point in the judgment, is this case illustrates the additional challenges, dangers to the integrity of racing posed by the widespread ability to back horses to lose for significant returns. So they're saying, you know, these other betting patterns, samples were taken, nothing untoward was found. However, tracing the beneficiaries is not easy, and secondly, being able to bet large sums on a horse losing, they're not so sure about that. I must say, I'm not so sure about it either. They do say there's no evidence linking Charles Byrnes with the betting patterns, but you might pick up the betting aspect of this, because that is opening a window for opportunists.
Yeah, but with respect to them in this, on one point in particular here, you know, the claim that, you know, there's a widespread threat by the ability to lay horses on these exchanges and so on, that's undesirable, if you like. These exchanges have been in existence for about 21 years now, so they're a bit late to the party in making that kind of observation. The point is they need to learn how to police it. Now, in their
It's
defence.
very difficult to police,
Very,
though. That, like, it jumps out to me. It jumps like we have to be realistic about human nature here. People cheat for just pride, and when there's money involved, people cheat all the more. How do you police this? Like, Dan used the phrase, some fairly blunt instruments taken here to ensure this horse didn't win. Like, there's lots of more subtle things you can do to ensure your horse isn't going to win.
Yeah, look, that's one of the kind of curious things about all this. I mean, we don't know the exact details, but the inference kind of is that rather than being given a bit of sedative on his tongue, he was given the whole tube. You know, I mean, it really was kind of, it seems very excessive. And, you know, if it was done in the way that it reads, then it seems fairly careless way of going about it, doesn't it? I mean, as you say, a blunt instrument, as Dan said. But the point about the exchanges is they have been in existence for over 20 years. And I remember I wrote a piece about this 3 years ago in relation to another case when there was a BHA case investigating Tim Brennan, who would have been Willie Mullins' vet, and whether or not he passed on inside information to someone else, to Leigh Faheen, after it emerged, after he learned that the horse was lame. Before the 2016 champion hurdle. The horse wasn't going to get there, and the BHA's case effectively, you know, suggested that Mr. Brennan passed on this information to someone else, and they then profited accordingly from it. The case didn't get anywhere. It was thrown out because because there is no way of establishing who is behind a lot of these accounts. In another case, the Dublin Racing Festival, I think 3 years ago now, 2018, there was a similar high-profile horses laid for big money and ran poorly, and that investigation went nowhere either. And the inference coming out of that, again, similar to today, was that, you know, there are some high-stakes traders, as we know them, in far-flung countries on another continent, was the expression used that time. This time we've heard about an individual on the other side of the world somewhere. You know, there's a kind of an exotic, mythical feel to it. You know, no one really knows anything about these kind of characters, but they're referred to constantly. They're basically portrayed as intermediaries or something like that. And that is the difficulty with this. There is a memorandum of understanding that the exchanges, you know, relay whatever information they can to the authorities for these investigations. But if you're an unlicensed individual by these authorities, you know, with the best will in the world, there's very little chance of anyone, you know, especially if you're living in a different jurisdiction on the other side of the world, you know, playing ball with the authorities. I mean, why should they? So they're protected to a certain extent, and they know that, and whoever it is that is dealing with them and using them as intermediaries is well aware of it as well. So it's a valid point. The exchanges present dangers that we didn't really have to the extent that we do now 20 odd years ago. You know, you had your straight bookmaker punter relation before. Now anyone can be the bookmaker and lay a horse for as much as they like. So it's a valid point, in fairness, but you know, the thing, it's there now. It's not going to go anywhere. It's a well-established massive business model. We need to find a way to try and police it better, and how they do that, I don't know, because we have data, as you well know, in the last few years, data protection is such a big thing these days that it's very hard to get information at the best of times, I'd imagine. Okay,
so that's the betting on the horse to lose aspect. You meant Jim Bulger then, you know, with the Racing Post, had those comments late last year where he effectively said doping, and he meant performance enhancing, I think, in this circumstance as opposed to the Charles Byrnes case. Doping is the #1 problem in the sport, he said. He said, I've knowledge of problems. I'd like to see the IHRB stepping up to the plate. Needs to be more rigorous testing. He also says, and this is interesting, action needs to happen after that testing's taken place. And I'm inclined to think we've had instances in the past where action wasn't taken when it should have been. To the best of what I could see today, Richard, in advance of talking to you, unannounced testing. The most prominent trainers maybe get one of those a year from the IHRB, as I understand it. That wouldn't strike me as very much.
Hard to know, because they don't confirm, you know, individual cases and where they are and whatnot. There's a lot going on there. I don't know more than anyone else what Jim is referring to, but historically he has always been a staunch advocate of stronger protocols in relation to anti-doping. 5 years ago we ran a piece with him where he was similarly not happy that certain things weren't being tested for, and we subsequently confirmed that in relation to cobalt and whatnot. There was then a change of lab in 2018. The long-standing Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board lab was BHP in Limerick, and at a cost of around $500,000. That deal was undone in the beginning of 2018, and they moved to LGC labs in Newmarket. Thereafter, there was a 440% increase in the amount of positive tests, which is just absolutely flabbergasting.
So and it shows what's been going on. How many positive tests, how many failed tests have there been, for instance, in Irish racing in the last 12 months, 24 months, give or take?
You're catching me on the hop there now, but they have come down remarkably since then, Joe. You see, what happened was ultimately, whether there was conscious, sinister is a word I use again, but maybe there's a better word in relation to performance-enhancing substances. But what happened a lot of the time was that lax practices snuck in relation to vitamins and supplements and whatnot.
Yeah.
Where there were certain substances that were not prohibited at all times, but had certain withdrawal times, but they were, when used correctly, they were perfectly acceptable and permitted and all that. But what happens when it kind of becomes known that certain things aren't being tested for, they're not able to test for them, then practices became lax. And a lot of the time it was fairly innocuous stuff.
Okay.
But there was no, up to the point of the lab change, for example, there was no positive test for steroids in Ireland, despite the fact that we had the Department of Agriculture lead the way and find steroids, on the premises of Pat Hughes and John Hughes and Philip Fenton. And yet there wasn't a single solitary test for steroids up to the point of view, up to the time of the change of lab. Now, since then, there has been a couple of positive cases, and you would take that as a relatively positive development in that they're being identified. Whatever about the individual cases, you'd hope that means that they're at least now catching them.
And what year did that happen again, the change of that lab?
The change of lab was February 18.
18, because that's when the IHRB took full control of everything, wasn't it?
Well, it's when LGC took over the testing, and that was significant because they simply weren't picking up as much as they should have been in the meantime. But what is interesting still about all that, and it keeps coming back to the how good your lab is ultimately. We had the case a couple of months ago of zilpaterol being found in the gain feed substances, the gain feed nuts. And it was categorically identified in the feed at Aidan O'Brien's, for example, and Aidan O'Brien did test and categorically identified it in his horses. Now, he had winners around that time, and the LGC lab in Newmarket never threw up any adverse finding in relation to those horses, but we know that the substance was there because Aidan came out and told us it was there.
Well, that's extremely worrying, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is, because the French lab was able to identify these substances, and it came out and told the public that they were there, and we subsequently heard about the horses involved. None of them, of course, were Aidan O'Brien's horses, despite the fact that he came out and told us that the substance had been identified. So, and the IHRB subsequently admitted that the LGC lab can test to the level that the French lab can in relation to that particular substance. Okay. Now, it might be a negligible level, it might have absolutely no bearing on it whatsoever, but it's another incidence of what you would have to say is substandard testing procedures. I mean, you're either pregnant or you're not. The substance is banned at all times. The French lab could identify it. The Irish and British lab, they both use the same. The BHA and the IHRB both use the same lab. They couldn't identify it. So again, another shortcoming there.
Right. Jim Bulger talked about hair testing as well, wanting to see that to come in, because hair testing, unlike urine, for instance, or bloods, if a horse had taken anything at any stage, it would show up in the hair testing. And the IHRB have said that has come in now. And that seems like a reasonable weapon that they have at their disposal. How many horses are being hair tested? I mean, is it few and far between, just so the IHRB can say, well, we're bringing it in, or is it reasonably comprehensive, or do we know?
We don't know really the full extent of it. They're definitely doing it. How much they're doing, or how much of those samples they are then testing, is a bit unclear at the moment. There's obviously a lot of cost involved. There is a kind of silver bullet here, Joe, that has been ignored for a long time, and it's something I've spoken about with Ruby Walsh previously, because in some of these cases, and not necessarily in today's one, but in some of the previous cases in relation to performance-enhancing substances, there has been a suggestion in the reports that the substance was administered by someone else or before the horse went into the trainer's care or something to that effect. And the solution to this is to test all of the thoroughbreds that are born every year and take basically a blood passport off them, a DNA passport. And once that's clean and the horse is sold, then the onus is on the buyer to get it tested again so that he has a clean passport. And every time it changes owner, it can be checked back, because it would just clarify an awful lot of, some of these vague cases where there is, as I said, a suggestion that the substance was administered before the horse came into the trainer's care. And that is another aspect of that then is the IHRB's ongoing kind of inability to test on unlicensed premises. So, for example, I keep a couple of young stock here in the back, basically in my back garden out in the field out the back. They have no jurisdiction over me historically they haven't. They actually have acquired it now, but they haven't started implementing it. So they couldn't just drive into my yard and demand to test the horses, whereas they have got that now, and they need to hurry up the process of implementing that, because that in itself is a massive weapon to deter it in pre-training yards or in sales preparation yards for horses that are going to the sales, so that they're not being artificially beefed up. They need to start getting in there and doing that. And whether, there are various reasons, I'm sure, why it hasn't happened. We won't go through them all now, but then that needs to happen.
Yes, okay. I'm sorry, as you can sense, I'm really rushing there at the end. The clock is certainly against me. No, but they're very important points, and I'm learning a lot from you here in this conversation. So just a last point then. Jim Bulger said it's the #1 problem in the sport. The very frank question I have to you is how widespread is this problem? Is this sport riddled? Like, is a day of reckoning coming here? Is this sport filthy?
I don't think so, no, and I genuinely believe that. I don't think so. When there is money involved and it's a competitive business, there will always be a percentage who look to gain an illegitimate edge. I don't think so. I have no reason to believe it is. But the point I make about this all the time is until that is transparently seen, that we can stand over the product and say our testing procedures are thorough, there is no question about this, then until we see that, it's very hard to say it. So my point about the regulator all along is that they have allowed too many questions to be left unanswered about all this, and they need to be stronger on it. And there has been criticism, as you well know, from David Walsh and Paul Kimmage lately, and a lot of those cases were historic. So, when you have the likes of those guys digging, you would always be conscious that they might unravel something, or as someone who's involved in the industry, to an extent you'd be fearful that they might unravel something. What they were dealing with was historic stuff, and another element that came out of that of their criticism was the lack of transparency in the reports. And today's report is 14 pages long.
Yeah, it's good.
I didn't do a word count on it, but every single report should be going into the same sort of detail, and they have not done that for long enough. Their modus operandi is to give everyone as little as they have to.
Right.
Now, I don't know who or why they're trying to protect people in that regard, but they should be coming out in these hearings and inquiries and giving as much detail as they can rather than as little as they can, because that has been the modus operandi up to now, and it's not good enough. Today's report, there are still questions from it, but you then look at it and say, could they have done any more? I would suggest possibly not.
Okay.
But at least we can read it and make that interpretation. Their hands are tied in relation to the exchange movements, but they put an awful lot of detail in there. They appear to have done the best they can with it, and you have to say, fair enough. We need to see that routinely and not every now and then.
Richard Forristal from the Racing Post. Thanks so much, Richard. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Off the Ball on News Talk.
Down to Earth on News Talk.
Down to Earth is a brand new podcast series exploring our natural environment and the limits of our planet's resources. Presented by me, Dr. Cara Augustenborg. I'll be joined by industry experts to discuss important environmental issues like pollution, energy, food sustainability, and the positive actions that we can take to future-proof our planet. And I'll be catching up with some well-known faces and discovering how they maintain their green life.
Down to Earth with Amundi.
Subscribe now to the podcast.